He was a titan of industry, a German CEO named Klaus Richter, whose name was whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence in boardrooms across the globe. She was Serafina Washington, a black maid, invisible to the echelons of power she served. At a lavish gala in a skyscraper that pierced the clouds, he decided to make her the target of a cruel joke, speaking in his native tongue, confident in her ignorance. He never imagined that his world was about to be shattered by the 5 words she would fire back in flawless German, silencing a room of billionaires and exposing a lie that would cost him everything. The city of New York glittered below the 80th floor ballroom of the Sterling Tower, a testament to the wealth and power consolidated within its glass and steel. Inside, the air hummed with the quiet confidence of the global elite. Men in bespoke tuxedos and women in gowns that cost more than a modest family car mingled their laughter, tinkling like the expensive crystal champagne flutes they held. This was the annual Sterling Gala, a self-congratulatory affair hosted by Sterling Industries, a multinational conglomerate with its fingers in every conceivable pie, from aerospace to pharmaceuticals. At the heart of this opulent universe was Klaus Richter, the CEO of Sterling's European division. A man sculpted from Bavarian granite, with a severe face, piercing blue eyes, and a mane of silver hair swept back from his high forehead. He moved through the crowd with the predatory grace of a wolf, his presence demanding and receiving fealty. People gravitated towards him, their smiles a little too bright, their handshakes lingering a moment too long. Klaus bathed in the attention, his ego nourished by the sycophantic praise. He was a king in his court, and he savored every moment of his reign. Tonight, however, a subtle irritation pricked at his otherwise perfect evening. The American division was outperforming his own. The numbers presented earlier in a closed-door meeting had been a quiet rebuke to his leadership. He, Klaus Richter, the man who had single-handedly conquered the European market, was being upstaged by what he considered to be a group of brash, unsophisticated cowboys. He needed to reassert his dominance, to remind everyone in this room of his inherent superiority. His eyes scanned the periphery, the invisible world of the service staff, who kept the gilded machine running smoothly. They were a blur of black and white uniforms, their faces trained to be pleasant, yet forgettable. They refilled glasses, cleared plates, and vanished into the background, their existence acknowledged only by its absence if a need went unfulfilled. It was here among the powerless that Klaus often found an outlet for his frustrations. A sharp word, a dismissive gesture, a look of contempt, small, satisfying assertions of his place in the world. Among the catering staff was a woman named Serafina Washington. To the guests, she was just the maid or the waitress. In her crisp, ill-fitting uniform, she was part of the furniture. But Serafina, or Sarah as she preferred, was anything but part of the background. Her eyes, the color of warm mahogany, missed nothing. She observed the subtle power plays, the false smiles, the desperate ambition that hung in the air like expensive cologne. She saw the tremor in the hand of a junior executive as he spoke to Klaus, the forced laughter of a wife clinging to the arm of her philandering husband. This room was a theater of human drama, and Sarah was a silent, astute spectator. Sarah was in her late 20s, though the weight of her experiences made her seem older. She moved with a quiet efficiency. Her steps measured her hands, steady. She had taken this job with a specific purpose, one that had nothing to do with serving canapés to the 1%. She was an observer, a gatherer of information, a ghost in the machine. Every conversation she overheard, every document she glimpsed, left carelessly on a table, was a piece of a puzzle she was meticulously assembling. Her target was Klaus Richter, not just the man, but the rotten core of his empire. For months she had been investigating Sterling Industries, following a trail of whispers and encrypted files that hinted at a massive corporate scandal, a web of corruption and exploitation that started and ended with the man holding court in the center of the room. The catering job was her way in a Trojan horse that allowed her to get closer to the heart of power than any journalist or regulator had ever managed. Klaus, blissfully unaware of the true identity of the woman refilling his water glass, was holding forth with a small group of admirers. His voice was a low, guttural rumble, his English precise but heavily accented. He was recounting a story about a hostile takeover, his words painting a picture of ruthless corporate warfare. The board was weak sentimental. Klaus sneered, taking a sip of his champagne. They spoke of loyalty, of tradition. I told them tradition is the enemy of progress. You must be willing to cut away the diseased limb to save the body. So I cut. He made a sharp chopping motion with his hand, and his audience chuckled appreciatively. Sarah moved towards his table to clear away some empty glasses. As she reached for a plate, one of Klaus's companions, an American CEO named Marcus Thorne, gestured towards her. "The service here is impeccable, Klaus," Marcus said, his voice slick with insincerity. "So discreet." Klaus glanced at Sarah, his eyes lingering on her for a fraction of a second too long. A cruel smirk played on his lips. He saw not a person, but an object, an opportunity. He decided it was time for a little amusement, a private joke for his inner circle. Leaning in towards his German-speaking CFO, Dieter Schmidt, Klaus switched to his native language. His tone was casual, laced with the easy arrogance of a man who believed he was utterly incomprehensible to those around him. "Sieh dir das an, Dieter," he said, his voice a low conspiratorial murmur. "Look at this. Das arme, dumme Ding. The poor, stupid thing. She probably doesn't even have 2 cents to rub together, yet she serves us as we decide the fate of nations. It's the natural order of things, isn't it? The strong and the weak." Dieter chuckled a dry, rasping sound. "Ja, der natürliche Lauf der Dinge." He agreed. Yes, the natural course of things. Klaus's gaze remained fixed on Sarah. He wanted to see if his words registered, if some flicker of understanding would cross her features. He expected nothing. He saw her as a simple creature, a product of a lesser world, incapable of understanding the sophisticated nuances of his language or his intellect. He was the predator, she was the prey, and the game was his to control. Sarah didn't flinch. Her expression remained placid, her movements fluid, as she continued to clear the table. She stacked the plates with practiced care, her focus seemingly entirely on her task. Inside, however, a cold fire ignited. She had heard every word, understood every ounce of condescension. His arrogance was breathtaking. It was also his greatest weakness. She placed the last plate onto her tray. For a moment, she paused, her back still to Klaus. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, the ambient chatter fading into a dull roar in her ears. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. Not the one she had planned, perhaps, but the one that had been presented to her. An opportunity to strip away the veneer of power and expose the ugly reality beneath. She could let it go. She could walk away, her cover intact, and continue her investigation in the shadows. It would be the safe, sensible thing to do. But as Klaus's mocking German words echoed in her mind, a different instinct took over. It was an instinct for justice, for defiance. It was the voice of every person he had ever trampled on his climb to the top. Slowly, deliberately, she turned around, her eyes no longer passive and observant, now blazed with a fierce intelligence. She looked directly at Klaus Richter, not as a maid to a CEO, but as an equal. The placid mask had fallen away, revealing the sharp, formidable woman beneath. The room, which had been a symphony of clinking glasses and hushed conversations, began to fall silent. The guests closest to the table sensed a shift in the atmosphere, a sudden, inexplicable tension. They turned to look, their curiosity piqued. Sarah took a step closer to the table. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm, clear, and utterly devastating. She looked Klaus Richter directly in the eye, and in perfect, unaccented, and icily formal German, she delivered her retort. Herr Richter, Ihre Arroganz ist nur von Ihrer Ignoranz übertroffen. The words hung in the air, sharp and precise as shards of glass. Mr. Richter, your arrogance is surpassed only by your ignorance. For a full 10 seconds the world stopped. The silence that descended upon the 80th floor ballroom was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered the clinking of glasses and the murmur of conversation. It was a silence born of pure, unadulterated shock. Jaws, both literal and metaphorical, hit the floor. The guests who had been idly watching the exchange froze their champagne flutes halfway to their lips. Marcus Thorne's ingratiating smile evaporated, replaced by a look of slack-jawed disbelief. Dieter Schmidt-Klaus's CFO turned a color best described as ashen, but all eyes were on Klaus Richter. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a waxy, translucent white. His piercing blue eyes, usually so full of cold command, were wide, with a mixture of fury and utter bewilderment. It was as if a statue had been slapped. He was a man who had built his life on control, on the unshakable belief in his own superiority and the predictable inferiority of others. In a single sentence, spoken in his own language by a woman he had dismissed as a piece of furniture, his entire world-view had been fractured. He stared at Serafina, truly seeing her for the first time. The nondescript maid's uniform seemed to melt away, and in its place stood a woman of formidable presence. Her stance was erect, her gaze unwavering. There was no fear in her eyes, only a cold, righteous anger that seemed to pin him to his chair. The power dynamic so firmly established just moments before had not just shifted, it had been violently inverted. Sarah held his gaze, refusing to back down. The adrenaline coursing through her veins had sharpened her senses to a razor's edge. She could feel the weight of every stare in the room, hear the frantic, unspoken questions racing through everyone's minds. Who was this woman? Where did she come from? And how in God's name did she speak German like a native? Klaus was the first to break the silence. His recovery was clumsy, a desperate attempt to regain control. He sputtered, searching for words, his mind, usually so quick and incisive, now a chaotic mess. Was haben Sie gesagt? He stammered, his German suddenly sounding thick and clumsy. What did you say? It was a weak, pathetic attempt to pretend he had misheard, to give himself a moment to recalibrate. Sarah did not give him the satisfaction of repeating herself in German. Instead, she switched to flawless, articulate English, her voice ringing with clarity in the silent room, ensuring every single person understood the next part of the exchange. I said, she began, her tone deliberate and cutting, that your arrogance is surpassed only by your ignorance. You assumed because I am a black woman, serving you drinks, that I am uneducated, that I am unintelligent, that I am deaf to your casual cruelty. You assumed wrong, Mr. Richter. Each word was a hammer blow, dismantling his carefully constructed persona of untouchable power. She wasn't just firing back, she was delivering a public lecture on his own prejudice. The crowd, which had been frozen in shock, began to murmur. The whispers spread like wildfire, a wave of speculation and excitement. This was better than any corporate drama they could have imagined. A live-action takedown of one of the world's most feared CEOs. Klaus's face, which had been pale with shock, now began to flush with a deep, apoplectic red. Humiliation was an emotion he was unfamiliar with, and it tasted like poison. He was being dressed down publicly by a servant. It was an unforgivable, unthinkable inversion of the natural order. He rose from his chair, his body trembling with rage. He loomed over Sarah, his physical size the only weapon he had left. "You are fired!" he bellowed, his voice echoing through the vast ballroom. Get out of my sight!" He pointed a shaking finger towards the service door, his knuckles white. The raw, unrestrained fury in his voice was meant to intimidate, to crush her. But Sarah did not flinch. She did not cower. She simply stood her ground, her expression one of almost pitying contempt. "You can't fire me, Mr. Richter," she said, her voice still remarkably calm. "And why is that?" he snarled, leaning in his face inches from hers. "Because I am not your employee." The twist landed with the force of a physical blow. A fresh wave of gasps rippled through the room. If she wasn't with the catering company, then who was she? What was she doing here? Klaus recoiled as if burned. "What is this nonsense, security? Get this woman out of here!" He roared, scanning the room for the uniformed guards who were usually so quick to respond to his every whim. But before security could react, another voice cut through the tension. It was a calm, authoritative voice, and it came from a man who had been sitting quietly at a nearby table, observing the entire scene with keen interest. He was a distinguished-looking older gentleman with a warm smile and sharp, intelligent eyes. "That won't be necessary, Klaus." The man stood up and walked towards them. As he did, a wave of recognition and respect rippled through the room. This was Robert Sterling, the founder and chairman of the board of Sterling Industries, a living legend in the business world, known for his integrity and his shrewd yet ethical approach to business. He was the patriarch of the entire organization, a man whose quiet authority far outweighed Klaus's blustering tyranny. "Robert," Klaus stammered, his fury momentarily forgotten, replaced by a new kind of fear. I was just dealing with an insubordinate." Robert Sterling ignored him. He walked straight to Sarah and extended his hand. "Ms. Washington, I presume," he said, his voice warm and respectful. "I'm Robert Sterling. It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person. Your reputation precedes you." Sarah took his hand, a small professional smile touching her lips. "Mr. Sterling, the pleasure is all mine." The entire room watched, utterly mesmerized, as the revered founder of the company shook hands with the maid who had just brought the CEO to his knees. The puzzle was becoming more complex, the intrigue more delicious. Klaus looked back and forth between Robert Sterling and Sarah, his mind struggling to process the scene. "Robert, you know this woman?" he asked, his voice now laced with a desperate confusion. Robert turned to face Klaus, his warm smile gone, replaced by a look of profound disappointment. "Know her, Klaus, I hired her." He let the words hang in the air for a moment, allowing their full impact to be felt. "Ms. Washington." Robert Sterling announced to the silent, captivated audience, "is not a waitress. She is one of the most brilliant forensic accountants and corporate investigators in the country. For the past 6 months, she has been leading a discreet internal investigation into numerous financial and ethical irregularities within our European division." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room before landing squarely on Klaus Richter. "An investigation." Robert Sterling continued, his voice like the crack of a whip, "that leads directly to you." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The room erupted. The silence was shattered not by whispers, but by a roar of shock, scandal, and dawning comprehension. Sarah was not a maid. She was a hunter. And Klaus Richter, the fearsome predator, had just realized he had been the prey all along. His world, built on a foundation of arrogance and deceit, had not just been cracked. It had been utterly and irrevocably demolished. The king had been dethroned in his own court, not by a rival, but by the very person he had considered beneath his notice. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Robert Sterling's words detonated in the ballroom with the force of a bomb, and the aftershocks ripped through the carefully curated atmosphere of power and prestige. The story was too perfect, too cinematic. The underdog heroine, the arrogant villain, the stunning reversal of fortune. It was the kind of corporate fairy tale that would be whispered about on Wall Street for years to come. Klaus Richter stood frozen, a monument to his own spectacular downfall. The red flush of anger had been replaced by a deathly pallor. His mind, which had always moved with the speed and precision of a high-performance engine, had seized completely. Forensic accountant, internal investigation, directly to you. The phrases echoed in his skull, each one a nail in the coffin of his career. He looked at Sarah, Ms. Washington, he corrected himself with a jolt, and saw her with terrifying clarity. The quiet efficiency, the observant eyes, the way she had moved through the periphery of his world. It hadn't been subservience. It had been surveillance. Every condescending remark he'd ever made to a staff member, every arrogant boast, every dismissive gesture now replayed in his memory, tainted with the horrifying realization that she might have seen it all. She hadn't just been serving drinks, she had been gathering evidence. His own hubris had been her greatest asset. The guests, no longer trying to be discreet, were now openly gawking their phones suddenly in their hands. The initial shock was giving way to a frenzied excitement. They were witnessing history. The implosion of Klaus Richter was a bigger story than any merger or acquisition that could have been announced that night. "Robert, this is absurd." Klaus finally managed to say, his voice a hoarse croak. He tried to project an air of authority, but it was like a scarecrow trying to command a storm. "A ridiculous accusation. This woman is clearly a fraud. You've been deceived." Robert Sterling's expression hardened. "The only one who has been deceived, Klaus, is me, and the shareholders of this company, for years." He turned to Sarah. "Ms. Washington, perhaps you can enlighten us." This was her stage now. The ballroom of the Sterling Tower was no longer a place of servitude, but a courtroom where she was both prosecutor and star witness. She met Robert Sterling's gaze with a nod of gratitude, and then turned to face the assembled crowd. She still held the silver tray with the empty glasses, a surreal prop in this high-stakes drama. With a steady hand, she placed it on a nearby table, the clinking sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. It was a symbolic act, a shedding of her disguise. "For 6 months," Sarah began, her voice steady and professional, "my team and I have been embedded within the operational and financial structures of Sterling Industries' European division. We were brought in by Mr. Sterling after an anonymous whistleblower raised concerns about significant discrepancies in the quarterly reports." She paused, letting the implication sink in. The anonymous whistleblower was a fabrication, a clever piece of misdirection by Robert Sterling to protect his true methods. But it served its purpose. We uncovered a sophisticated scheme designed to inflate profits and conceal massive liabilities. Sarah continued her words, precise and damning. "A scheme that involved dummy corporations, fraudulent invoicing, and the systematic exploitation of labor in several of your overseas factories." As she spoke, she painted a picture of corporate malfeasance that was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. She spoke of shell companies registered in Panama and the Cayman Islands, of phantom suppliers who were paid millions for services never rendered, of safety reports being falsified in textile mills in Southeast Asia, leading to preventable accidents and injuries. She used technical terms, channel stuffing off-balance sheet entities round-tripping, with an ease that left no doubt as to her expertise. This wasn't a vague accusation, it was a surgical dissection of a criminal enterprise. Klaus listened, his face a mask of disbelief. He had been so careful. His schemes were buried under layers of complex transactions, protected by a firewall of loyal subordinates and intimidated accountants. How could she have possibly unraveled it all? These are lies! He roared, finding his voice again. Fabrications. You have no proof. Sarah's expression remained impassive. On the contrary, Mr. Richter, we have everything. She turned her gaze back to Robert Sterling. Mr. Sterling, with your permission. Robert nodded grimly. Proceed. Sarah reached into the small, discreet pocket of her uniform, a pocket that had been specially sewn in to hold not a notepad, but a high-capacity encrypted USB drive. She held it up for all to see. It was small, black, and innocuous, yet it contained the digital equivalent of a nuclear bomb. This drive, she announced, contains copies of every fraudulent invoice, every doctored financial statement, every incriminating email, and every secret ledger from the past 5 years. It contains sworn video-recorded affidavits from employees you threatened into silence. It even includes a recording of a conversation you had last Tuesday in your Berlin office with Dieter Schmidt, in which you discussed how to creatively account for a €50 million loss from a failed venture. Dieter Schmidt, who had been trying to shrink into the background, let out a small, strangled gasp. He looked at Klaus with eyes full of terror and betrayal. Sarah then delivered the final devastating blow. And just 30 minutes ago, as you were so eloquently mocking my supposed station in life, the originals of all these documents, along with a comprehensive report from my team, were delivered by secure courier to the offices of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Department of Justice, and the Bundeskriminalamt in Germany. The room erupted. The German Federal Criminal Police Office. This wasn't just a corporate scandal anymore. It was an international criminal investigation. Klaus Richter was not just going to be fired, he was going to prison. The carefully constructed world of Klaus Richter crumbled to dust. His power, his reputation, his freedom, all gone incinerated in the blaze of her revelations. He looked around the room at the faces of the people who had once courted his favor. He saw no sympathy, no support, only a morbid, ravenous curiosity. He was no longer one of them. He was a spectacle. His eyes fell on Marcus Thorne, the American CEO who had been so eager to laugh at his joke. Marcus avoided his gaze, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on his dinner plate. His other companions were already subtly distancing themselves physically and reputationally. The rats were leaving the sinking ship. With a primal roar of pure, impotent rage, Klaus lunged, not at Sarah, but at the table, sweeping his arm across it, sending champagne glasses, plates and cutlery crashing to the floor in a cacophony of shattering crystal and clattering silver. It was the desperate, futile act of a caged animal, a final pathetic display of fury before the inevitable end. Security guards who had been held at bay by Robert Sterling's presence now moved in. They were no longer there to eject a troublesome maid. They were there to contain a disgraced CEO on the verge of a complete breakdown. They flanked him, their hands resting cautiously on his arms. Klaus didn't resist. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a chilling, hollow emptiness. He stared at Sarah, his blue eyes, once so full of fire, now dull and vacant. He had been beaten. He had been outsmarted. He had been destroyed by a ghost, a woman he had never even seen. As the guards began to lead him away through the stunned and silent crowd, he spoke one last time, his voice barely a whisper, a question directed at the woman who had orchestrated his demise. Why? It was a question born not of anger, but of a desperate, gnawing need to understand. Why go to such lengths? Why this elaborate, humiliating charade? Sarah met his gaze one last time. There was no triumph in her eyes, no gloating, only a quiet, resolute sense of purpose. "You mentioned the natural order of things, Mr. Richter," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "You believe it's about the strong and the weak. But you're wrong. It's about right and wrong. It's for the people in your factories whose safety you gambled with. It's for the investors whose trust you betrayed. It's for every person you ever looked down on, every person you ever dismissed as a poor, stupid thing." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then added in the same perfect, chilling German that had started it all, "Das ist der natürliche Lauf der Dinge." This is the natural course of things. The guards led a broken Klaus Richter out of the ballroom, his reign of terror over. The doors swung shut behind him, leaving a room full of the world's most powerful people, in stunned silence, their gazes fixed on the woman in the simple black and white uniform, who had proven to be the most powerful person of all. The maid had not just silenced the room, she had brought down an empire. The departure of Klaus Richter did not end the story, it merely closed a chapter. What followed was a complex and far-reaching aftermath, a ripple effect that spread from the glittering ballroom of the Sterling Tower to the farthest corners of the global economy. The events of that night became a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and on trading floors, the Sterling Gala takedown. In the immediate aftermath, the ballroom was a scene of controlled chaos. Robert Sterling, ever the statesman, quickly took charge. He calmly addressed the shell-shocked guests, assuring them that the company was stable, that the board had been aware of the investigation, and that swift action would be taken to rectify the damage. His calm demeanor was a masterclass in crisis management, but beneath the surface, a seismic shift was occurring. Serafina Washington became the reluctant center of this new universe. As the guests began to process the sheer audacity of what they had witnessed, they swarmed her. CEOs who an hour ago wouldn't have given her a second glance were now desperately trying to catch her eye, to shake her hand, to get her card. They saw in her not just an investigator, but a new kind of power player. Someone with the intelligence, the courage, and the moral clarity that so many of them secretly knew was lacking in their world. Mrs. Washington, a truly remarkable piece of work, gushed a hedge fund manager, a man known for his ruthless tactics. If you ever consider a move into private equity, my door is always open. Incredible, muttered a tech billionaire. Absolutely incredible. We need people like you in Silicon Valley. Sarah handled the sudden influx of attention with the same grace and composure she had displayed throughout the entire ordeal. She was polite but firm, deflecting the job offers and the effusive praise. She wasn't interested in becoming one of them. Her purpose had been justice, not personal gain. Working with Robert Sterling and the company's legal team, she spent the next few hours coordinating with the authorities on both sides of the Atlantic. Her encrypted USB drive was a Rosetta Stone of corporate crime, and it unlocked a wave of legal action. Warrants were issued. Offices were raided in New York, London, and Berlin. Dieter Schmidt. Klaus's terrified CFO was taken into custody as he tried to board a flight to a country with no extradition treaty. He began singing like a canary the moment investigators presented him with a transcript of his recorded conversation with Klaus. The story broke to the public the next morning, and it was a media firestorm. Theo mocked Maid in German. She was the undercover investigator who took him down. The headlines were sensational, irresistible. News outlets scrambled to piece together the identity of the mysterious Serafina Washington. She became an overnight sensation, a folk hero for the modern age. The image of the Black Maid confronting the arrogant German billionaire was instantly iconic, a powerful symbol of the powerless speaking truth to power. The impact on Sterling Industries was immense. The stock plummeted in the initial hours of trading as the market reacted to the scandal. Yet something unexpected happened. As Robert Sterling held a press conference, flanked by a stoic and professional Sarah Washington, he laid out the full extent of the rot they had uncovered and presented a clear, transparent plan for reform. He didn't downplay the crisis. He owned it. He announced the immediate suspension of all executives implicated in the scheme, the creation of a new independent ethics committee, and a substantial fund to compensate the exploited factory workers. And he introduced Sarah not as a temporary contractor, but as the new head of the company's global compliance and ethics division, with a direct line to the board and unprecedented authority to investigate any corner of the company, no matter how powerful the executive. This bold, decisive action had a surprising effect. The stock, after its initial nosedive, began to stabilize, then slowly climb. Investors, it turned out, valued transparency and integrity more than they feared a scandal. Robert Sterling's and Sarah's handling of the crisis was seen as a sign of strength, a promise that the company was serious about cleaning house. They had turned a potential catastrophe into a story of redemption. But the ripples extended far beyond Sterling Industries. The case became a catalyst for change. The details of the exploitation in Klaus's supply chain, brought to light by Sarah's investigation, sparked public outrage. Activist groups and NGOs seized on the story, launching campaigns and boycotts against other corporations with questionable labor practices. The Sterling Standard, as it came to be known, became a new benchmark for corporate responsibility. Companies across the globe suddenly found their own ethics and compliance departments under intense scrutiny, both internally and externally. Sarah, in her new role, was relentless. She was no longer a ghost in the machine. She was its conscience. She traveled the world, visiting the very factories Klaus had exploited. She met with the workers, listened to their stories, and implemented sweeping changes to ensure their safety and fair treatment. She tore down the opaque corporate structures Klaus had built and replaced them with systems designed for transparency and accountability. She was tough, demanding, and utterly incorruptible. There was, however, a personal cost to her newfound fame. Her life was no longer her own. She was recognized everywhere she went. She received thousands of emails and letters a day. Some were job offers, some were marriage proposals, and many were desperate pleas for help from people trapped in their own exploitative situations. The weight of being a symbol, a beacon of hope, was heavy. She also had to contend with the lingering remnants of Klaus's network. Though he was awaiting trial, disgraced and stripped of his power, he still had loyalists, people whose own fortunes were tied to his. There were subtle threats, veiled warnings, and a smear campaign launched in the dark corners of the internet, attempting to discredit her, to paint her as a fame-hungry opportunist. One evening, a brick was thrown through the window of her new apartment, a crude but clear message. This was the part of the story the headlines didn't cover, the lonely, frightening reality of taking on a corrupt and powerful system. There were moments of doubt, of fear. Had she done the right thing? Had she put a target on her back? It was during one of these moments of doubt that she received an unexpected visitor at her office. It was a young woman, an intern from the legal department. The woman was nervous, fidgeting with the strap of her bag. "Miss Washington," she began, her voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry to bother you, but I had to thank you." "For what?" Sarah asked kindly. "My father." The intern said, her eyes welling up with tears. "He worked at one of the plants in Malaysia. The one where the accident happened last year. He was one of the men who was injured because of the faulty equipment Klaus Richter refused to replace. The intern took a shaky breath. When the news broke, when we heard what you did. For the first time in a year, I saw my father smile. The settlement fund your company set up, it's going to pay for his medical care for everything we lost. You didn't just expose a criminal, Ms. Washington. You gave my family its life back. The young woman's words cut through Sarah's fear and doubt, reminding her of the why. It wasn't about fame or power or even revenge against one arrogant man. It was about the real lives impacted by the cold, impersonal decisions made in boardrooms thousands of miles away. It was for the father in Malaysia, for the families struggling to make ends meet, for the silent, invisible people whose voices were never heard. Sarah stood up, walked around her desk, and gave the young intern a hug. In that moment, the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. The path she had chosen was difficult and dangerous, but it was the right one. The takedown at the gala was not the end. It was the beginning of a much longer, much more important fight. And Serafina Washington was just getting started. The natural course of things was not inevitable. It had to be fought for one corrupt CEO, one injustice at a time. The trial of Klaus Richter was not merely a legal proceeding. It was global theatre. Dubbed the Trial of the Titan by a voracious press, it captivated the world, transforming the stately marble-halled Thurgood Marshall United States Courthouse in Lower Manhattan into the epicenter of a modern morality play. Every morning a phalanx of cameras and reporters greeted the key players. Klaus Richter, gaunt and grim-faced, arrived in a black town car, his bespoke suits hanging slightly loose on a frame, diminished by stress. He was flanked by a team of ferociously expensive lawyers, chief among them, Benjamin Croft, a man renowned for his courtroom savagery and his ability to turn victims into aggressors. Serafina Washington arrived on foot, usually accompanied by the stoic, paternal figure of Robert Sterling. She eschewed power suits for simple, elegant dresses in muted tones. Her calm, composed demeanor was her armor. She met the flashbulbs and shouted questions, not with fear or arrogance, but with a quiet, unassailable dignity that seemed to infuriate the tabloids looking for a more dramatic heroine. Inside courtroom 26B, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Klaus and Sarah sat on opposite sides of the room, two poles of a story that had rocked the foundations of the corporate world. Klaus refused to look at her, staring straight ahead with a look of theatrical disdain. Sarah, however, would occasionally let her gaze rest on him, not with hatred, but with the cool, analytical focus of an entomologist studying a particularly venomous specimen. The prosecution had built a mountain of evidence, but they knew the case would hinge on the credibility of their star witness. When Serafina was called to the stand, a hush fell over the packed gallery. She moved with a steady grace, took the oath, and sat her posture perfect, her hands resting calmly in her lap. For 3 days, Benjamin Croft circled her like a shark. His strategy was a classic attack the messenger campaign, designed to paint Sarah as a duplicitous, fame-hungry crusader with a personal vendetta against the successful and powerful. Ms. Washington. Croft began his voice, a smooth, dangerous purr. For 6 months, you lived a lie. You wore a costume, you adopted a false identity. You deceived your colleagues, the catering staff, and you served coffee to the very man you were plotting to destroy. Would that be an accurate summary? I was conducting a covert investigation into criminal activity, Mr. Croft. Sarah replied, her voice even and clear, resonating through the courtroom's microphones. Deception was a necessary tool to uncover a much greater deception, one that defrauded this company's shareholders of hundreds of millions of dollars. A necessary tool, Croft repeated, savoring the phrase. So you believe the ends justify the means, that it's acceptable to lie, to manipulate, as long as it achieves your desired outcome. My desired outcome was to expose the truth. Mr. Richter's desired outcome was to enrich himself at the expense of others. I do not believe the two are morally equivalent. The courtroom buzzed. Croft's attempt to frame her as unethical was backfiring. She was turning his questions into an indictment of his client. He shifted his line of attack, bringing up her past, his investigators having dug deep into her life. Let's talk about your background, Miss Washington. You grew up in a working-class neighborhood. In Queens, did you not? Raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs. You attended City College on a scholarship. It's fair to say you've spent your life as an outsider, looking in at the world of men, like my client, Klaus Richter. He let the implication hang in the air, the politics of envy. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. Mr. Croft, my mother, taught me the value of integrity and hard work. She taught me that you don't take what isn't yours. My background didn't give me a chip on my shoulder. It gave me a moral compass. It's a compass that tells me it's wrong to falsify safety reports in a factory leading to workers being injured. It's a compass that tells me it's wrong to create shell corporations to hide losses. Perhaps if Mr. Richter had grown up with a little less, he might understand a little more about right and wrong. It was a master stroke. She had not only defended her background, but had turned it into a source of moral authority. Several members of the jury, ordinary men and women, nodded subtly. They understood her world far better than they understood Klaus's. Frustrated, Croft became more aggressive. You speak of these workers, but you used them, didn't you? You pretended to be one of them, these invisible people, yet you held a Yale MBA all along. Weren't you just as condescending in your own way as you accuse Mr. Richter of being? No, Mr. Croft, Sarah said, her voice dropping, slightly gaining a new intensity. I didn't pretend to be one of them. I listened to them. I heard their stories. I saw the pictures of their families they kept in their lockers. I learned the name of the man in the Malaysian plant who lost the use of his hand because management, on Mr. Richter's direct orders, refused to pay for a $10,000 safety guard on a piece of machinery. His name is Mr. Kumar. He has 3 children. The difference between Mr. Richter and me is that Mr. Richter saw Mr. Kumar as a number on a balance sheet. I saw him as a human being. The name Mr. Kumar landed with the force of a physical blow. It made the crime real, personal. The abstract numbers and corporate jargon were suddenly replaced by the image of a father who could no longer provide for his family. The turning point of the trial, however, was the video affidavit of Günther Schmidt, the timid accountant from Berlin. When his pale, terrified face appeared on the large screens in the courtroom, the atmosphere became electric. In a halting, tearful voice, Günther detailed the years of intimidation. He described how Klaus had cornered him in his office and laid out the fraudulent accounting scheme, making it clear that refusal was not an option. He smiled, Günther recounted, wiping his eyes with a trembling hand. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, Günther, remember, numbers are not facts. They are opinions. And in this company, my opinion is the only one that matters. Don't force me to have a negative opinion of you. As his own words echoed through the silent courtroom, Klaus Richter's mask of defiance finally cracked. He slumped in his chair, his face ashen. He was not just watching evidence being presented against him. He was witnessing the public broadcast of his soul's deepest ugliness. The jury watched him, their expressions ranging from pity to pure disgust. They saw him not as a titan, but as a bully. The guilty verdict, when it came, was a formality. The foreman read it out on all major counts: fraud, conspiracy money, laundering, his voice firm and resolute. Klaus Richter, CEO, titan of industry, master of the universe, was now a convicted felon. At the sentencing hearing a week later, the judge was merciless. "Mr. Richter," he said, his voice ringing with judicial fury, "you have displayed a level of arrogance and a contempt for the law that is simply staggering. You viewed your employees not as people, but as pawns, and your investors not as partners, but as marks. You did this not out of desperation, but out of pure, unadulterated greed. You betrayed every trust placed in you." He looked up from his papers and stared directly at the broken man before him. "You are a cancer on the free market you claim to champion. It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to 25 years in federal prison." As bailiffs moved to take him away, Klaus's gaze swept the courtroom one last time, landing on Sarah. The hatred was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunting emptiness. In her face, he saw the architect of his ruin, a force of nature he had been too arrogant to see until it was too late. In the year that followed, Sarah Washington proved that her mission was not simply to tear down, but to build up. As the new executive VP for global compliance and ethics at Sterling Industries, she wielded her authority with surgical precision. The Sterling Standard became her mantra. She flew to the Malaysian plant and personally oversaw the installation of new state-of-the-art safety equipment. She met with Mr. Kumar and his family, offering a personal apology on behalf of the company and ensuring his compensation package was more than generous. She established the Serafina Washington Foundation for Labor and Education, funded by a mandated percentage of Sterling's profits. The foundation's first act was to create a scholarship program for the children of all overseas factory workers, giving them access to educational opportunities their parents could only dream of. But it was a small, quiet moment back in New York that brought the true meaning of her journey into focus. An intern from the legal department, a young Hispanic woman named Sophia, nervously approached her in the hallway. "Ms. Washington," she said, clutching a file to her chest. I just wanted to. My uncle worked for a subcontractor that Mr. Richter's division bankrupted. He lied to them about a contract, and they lost everything. My family. It was a very hard time." Sophia took a deep breath, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "When we read about what you did, my uncle, a proud man, he never cries. He wept. You didn't just get justice for the shareholders. You got it for the little guys, the ones nobody ever sees. You gave my family our dignity back." The word struck Sarah more deeply than any headline or accolade. This was the why. It was for Sophia's uncle, for Mr. Kumar, for every person who had been ground up by the gears of Klaus's avarice. That evening, Sarah visited a community center in Queens. Her foundation was now funding, not far from where she grew up. She watched a group of teenage girls huddled around a table, animatedly debating a robotics project. They were bright, loud, and full of limitless potential. She saw herself in them. She saw the future she was fighting for. Her thoughts drifted back to the opulent ballroom, the clinking champagne glasses, and the moment of decision. The cruel German words, the choice to speak. It was a single spark that had ignited a revolution. It had proven that the natural order of things was not immutable. It was not a rigid hierarchy of the strong and the weak. It was a constantly shifting moral landscape, and with enough courage, a single person could reshape it, bending its arc however slightly toward justice. The Titan was in a cage, but her work, had only just begun. That's the incredible true-to-life story of how a single moment of arrogance led to the downfall of an empire. Serafina Washington's story is a powerful reminder that courage, intelligence, and integrity can be found in the most unexpected places. It shows us that you should never, ever underestimate someone based on their job, their uniform, or your own prejudice. The world is full of brilliant, capable people, and true power doesn't come from a title or a bank account, but from the strength of your character. What did you think of Sarah's epic comeback? What would you have done in her position? Let us know in the comments below. If you are inspired by this story and want to hear more tales of justice, empowerment, and incredible twists of fate, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us to keep finding and telling these amazing stories. Thanks for watching.